So this bright one right here in the front, this pink or purple or whatever color you want to call that, this is called Aster Alert. And it's a really, really nice aster. It's about 1.5 feet tall, blooms really well, and I'd recommend it to anyone. Asters can be great plants. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a second. Next, I want to talk about this yellow plant, and that's a chrysanthemum. A question I see all the time in the fall is this: can I take these potted mums, these chrysanthemums, can I take those and put them in the garden, and will they come back in the spring? Are they true perennials? And the answer to that is sort of. So you have to understand that these chrysanthemums were not bred to be good perennials in our gardens. Many of these grow in much warmer climates, and then they bring them up here and get them ready for fall. And they're really designed to be enjoyed in the fall and then thrown away. The plants are fed heavily, they're pruned so you get lots of flowers on them, and they're quite worn out by October, November. Now, if you do want to try them, what I suggest you do is buy them early, as soon as they come on sale, and plant them right away. Don't keep them in pots for 2 months and then plant them. That doesn't work so well. If you plant them right away, there's enough time in September, October, and half of November for them to make a good root system. Then there's a much better chance that they come back. In my experience, many of them don't come back, or they come back for a year or two and then peter out. So many years ago, I went out and bought 3 different ones, put them in the garden, 2 came back. The year after, only 1 came back, and it turned out to be this yellow chrysanthemum. So this is one of these potted mums, and I had it in the garden for probably 10 years. But to be honest, I don't have it anymore, and I'm not quite sure why. It's quite possible that something else overgrew it. But if you do want to do this, plant them early. There's some great asters for the garden. This one's called Alma Potscake. It's taller, so it'll bloom at about 3 feet tall. Got this gorgeous color. The one problem I have with this plant is that the leaves look just like goldenrod. In the spring, when I'm weeding out, I'm pulling out the goldenrod, and this poor guy gets pulled out some years. And so now I actually have stakes around it to mark where it is, because I can't really tell the difference between this and goldenrod early in the season. Obviously, once it flowers, it's not easy to tell apart. There are some good garden chrysanthemums, and unfortunately I don't see a lot of them in nurseries. Here's one that I've had for many, many years called Claricurtis. It's a pastel colored one. It's kind of a light pink. Flowers well every year. Takes zero care. It just comes back all the time. It's 3.5 feet tall. It's a bit floppy, but not too bad. So what you can do, early June, come along and cut them off about halfway to the ground. That way you'll end up with a shorter plant and it won't be nearly so floppy. But Claricurtis is a good plant. It does spread a little faster than I like, but I wouldn't really call it aggressive. There's a whole bunch of asters called wood. So the wood's white, the wood's blue, the wood's something else. I don't know what this one's called. These are all great, great plants. They grow somewhere to about 6 to 8 inches and then flower. And most years you get a pretty good display. Some years, though, they get a disease, and it's a kind of rust that they get, and it kind of kills the plants. And if that happens, you just won't get very many flowers at the end of the season. So I have great flowering for 3-4 years in a row, and then I just have a really bad year, and all the asters seem to catch the same disease. They look really good this year. They're big, strong plants. They look really healthy. I don't see any disease on them, so I'm expecting a really good display. This is Woods Pink. Now wild asters, they can be good too. So this one popped up in my garden, and it's a beautiful plant. It's quite large. I mean, the picture we're looking at here is 3.5 feet tall, 4 feet wide, just covered in flowers. And it came back year after year and was there for a long time. Great display every year. So in a slightly different part of the garden, I had some other wild asters come up. If you want to have a real challenge, try and ID the species of white asters in Ontario. There's quite a few of them, and I can't tell one from the other. But anyways, I had this other white aster and I thought, oh great, I'll just leave it in the garden and let it flower. And it did. Great display. Next year, I had that aster everywhere. It seeded like crazy. Now these are slightly different plants. One seeds a lot, one doesn't seed at all. And it took me quite a few years to get the other one out of the garden. So be a little careful with these white asters, but there are some good ones out there. Here's a plant that most people wouldn't consider as a fall blooming plant. This is an Artemisia that I don't actually have a proper name for. It's really a summer flowering plant. The flowers aren't really that special. You're really growing it for this gray leafy material that it produces. But it lasts well into winter and is really there even in the spring. So it can be used as a really nice fall display, even though it's a summer plant. Get double duty out of it. So in the background here you can see some blue asters blooming. Those are wild on my property and I kind of leave them if they're not crowding things out. And the plant right in front is a smoke bush. This particular one is called Grace and it's an absolutely lovely plant. It's kind of green in this picture, but if you catch the sun just right on it, these leaves are quite orangey red. They're really colorful in the spring and they're kind of reddish all summer long, and then even in the fall they go red again. So if you want a smoke bush and you're more interested in nice leaves, get Grace. The problem with Grace is that it doesn't flower as much as some of the other smoke bush, but this is a great plant. Here's one of my all-time favorites. If you've ever listened to any of my talks about shade gardens, this one's always in there. This is commonly called the stinking Hellebore. Now, don't let that name throw you off. I've had quite a few people in the garden and they stand right beside it and they can't smell anything. You really have to crush the leaves and then you do get this slightly offensive odor. So I'm not sure why they're called stinking Hellebores. They should be called the Great Hellebore. Now the flowers on these are not quite as nice as some of the other Hellebores. They're kind of a limey green and they don't open quite so well. But the nice thing about this plant is it has this bluish green leaf. It's evergreen. It's there all year long. So it's a great display. It goes well with hostas because the leaf shape is so different. And as the hostas are going yellow, this will still be green, and then you get this really nice contrast in both leaf shape and color. Now in our climates, the buds get killed in some years. The buds are actually formed in the fall and they have to overwinter, and you don't always get flowering. But the flowers aren't that great anyway, so I don't really worry too much about this. I'm more interested in the leaves. The plant itself seems to be hardy for 3-4 years, and then for some reason it dies out. But by then you've got babies around it. This plant has been in the garden for at least 10 years. I won't lose it. I always have enough babies around it to give to friends, and when this big clump in the middle dies out, one of the babies will take over. This is an absolutely fabulous plant for a shade garden. Russian sage. These things are great. They smell really strong. They have this nice blue color. These will look nice now for several months. You can get them in the tall form, which is about 4 to 5 feet tall, depending on what kind of conditions you give it. But there's some smaller varieties available now that only grow 2 feet tall. Ferns. They're not really fall plants, but ferns look nice all summer and fall. Nice green color. Many of them will be evergreen and keep this green color over the winter. Unfortunately, with a lot of snow cover, the leaves do get kind of damaged and broken, so by spring they look kind of ratty. But at least until the snow flies, these things will look good in the garden, and there's literally hundreds to choose from. The sneezeweed is a great plant. It's a tall one, so we're talking about 4 or 5 feet tall. Comes in colors of oranges and yellows. There's a number of different cultivars out now. and they're a really nice plant. If that's too tall for you, I now have one that I still have in a pot, which I'll be planting this fall, and the plant itself is only about a foot and a half tall. Flowers are a little smaller, but quite a good size for the plant. And this is one of the sort of stars in the fall garden. Doesn't look much like anything all year long. The leaves again look very much like goldenrod, so if you're weeding goldenrod, be a little careful which clump you pick. The sedums, which are no longer sedums, they're called something else now, but we're going to continue calling them sedums. I don't think the gardeners are going to change. And you probably know some of the green varieties. I'm not going to talk about those. This here is kind of a unique variety. It's readily available, so it's not that unique, but I don't see it in a lot of gardens. The leaves are a very light green, even a chartreuse type of green, and the flowers are this light pinky color, and it's called neon. I assume because of the flowers. They're quite fantastic. These sedums are great. They can take lots of sun. They can take drought. You never have to worry about watering them. In fact, watering these guys too much is actually harmful to them. The growth gets soft and they get floppy. This time of the year, they're just covered in all kinds of pollinators. If you want more of these, or if your friend has one of these, if they're not looking when you're in their garden, just snip off a little stem, take it home, pot it up. It will root and grow. Really easy to propagate. Now, in the last 10 years, there have been quite a few red varieties come on the market, and I've tried quite a few of them. This particular one is one I've kept. It's not too bad. But what I find with the red ones is that the stems are just not strong enough and they get floppy. So they look great in midsummer. You think, okay, I'm going to get this great flower display, and they're looking great. And then somewhere in August, early September, the whole thing kind of just falls apart and flops. The flower heads are too big for the stems. Unfortunately, I don't know the cultivar name of this one. If you want a red one, the best thing to do is really find a friend who has a good one and get a cutting from them, because most of the ones in the market are really not worth buying. Fall crocus. Well, this is what everybody calls it, but these are not crocus. These are colchicums. And although the flowers look very similar, they're actually completely different species of plants. And gardeners really should start differentiating these because they do grow a little differently. Now, how do you tell a crocus from a colchicum? Well, you count the number of stamens in here. And if you look closely at these, you'll see there's 6 stamens. That's a colchicum. If you only have 3, it's a crocus. Now, the great thing about colchicum is that they make the flowers in the fall without any leaves. So the leaves you see in this picture here are a daylily that's growing nearby. It's not the actual colchicum. They will flower for a 3-4 week period when there's very little in the garden, and then they go back underground, and they'll have leaves in the spring and no flowers, and then the leaves go underground. So in the middle of summer, there's nothing there. And so that's one of the things you have to design for. You know, wherever you put these, what is it going to look like in the middle of summer? And it's been a bit of a struggle for me. I have them under some trees. The leaves are fine in the spring because the trees haven't leafed out, but lower branches will cover these and they're kind of hidden. So they do need to go out in their own space. And I think what I've decided now is the best thing to do is put them in an open area, but have other stuff around it to keep more interest for the rest of the year, because you'll have this open space. These are actually true crocus, and I know they look the same. There's lots of fall crocus, and this is a very common one that you should be able to get easily in a nursery. Japanese anemone. There's lots of anemone around. There's spring ones, there's fall ones. These really grow in the summer and then flower this time of the year. Now this particular one is called Pamina, and it's not flowering yet, even though the goldenrod is flowering, but the buds are all there. I have another one beside this clump that's in full flower right now. The big problem with these plants is they spread quite a bit, and they spread through runners, not so much the seeding. But Pamina is a little shorter and spreads a little slower than most of the other ones I've tried. So I highly recommend this one. It's got this semi-double flower that looks quite nice. It's a little daintier plant. Some of the other anemones can look too big and gaudy. And if you take this and grow it in part shade, they spread less. What I've pretty much done in my garden now is I've taken all the Japanese anemones and I put them in areas where they can spread. I'm not going to fight these guys anymore. So they're at the edge of the gardens, they're in the wooded areas or near the wooded areas. And if they spread, they have to compete with the sugar maples, and there's only so far they can go. Here's one of my all-time favorite plants, and I always recommend this as a summer flowering plant because that's when it flowers, and that's actually when it looks best. And that's Germination sanguineum. It's a low-growing plant, 6 inches tall at most. Flowers most of the year, still flowering now a little bit. But as fall approaches, the leaves get a nice red coloration to them. And it's a no-maintenance plant. I never have to weed underneath these guys. They're thick enough that they cover the ground. They don't spread too fast. So every 3 or 4 years, I will hack them back to about half the size and then let them grow for 3 or 4 years and do it again. The flowers do come in different colors. So there's some pinks, there's some whites, there's some white stripes. Everybody should have at least one sanguinea. Here's a plant that's not too well known. It is an Ontario native, and that's a turtle head. And they're flowering right now. And they have these nice big green buds and these flowers that open underneath, and the color contrasts really nice. If you want a really bright colored one, get hot lip. The native one is pink, but it's not quite this bright. If you like bright pinks, get yourself a hot lip. And they do come in white as well. Here's an allium. So alliums are ornamental onions. Some of the first things that flower in my garden are alliums. And the last plant to open its buds is an allium. And it's this one. It's called Ozawa. This plant is about 8 inches tall, maybe 10 inches. The rest of the year it's just this grassy material coming up. It doesn't seed around, so a lot of alliums you have to be careful of because they seed themselves and they spread everywhere. And you might have guessed by now I don't like that in plants. But I think this one flowers so late that in our climate it can't make seeds. It's a bit tricky to find in nurseries, but they are around, so Ozawa. Here's another fall flowering allium called ramosum. White flowering, very nice. The problem with this one is it self-seeds quite a bit and it can become quite weedy. So I do keep a clump of this because it's in flower right now. It looks great. It's covered with bees. But when it's finished flowering, I will come and deadhead this because I know if I don't, I'll be pulling them out for the next 3 years. This would be a great plant if you wanted to naturalize it somewhere. And my latest book is called Soil Science for Gardeners. Walk through the whole process of understanding soil. So the first part, you get all the background information to understand what is pH, what is soil. In the second part, I give you various ways of measuring your soil and trying to understand the quality and the problems you have in your soil. And then the third part is sort of a self-remediation plan. And you put it together based on what you found in the second section, and then you go through and improve your soil.